And then, of course, we've got the 6 practices of trust-based philanthropy. These are the grant-making practices. Today, we're going to focus on those first 3. But all of these collectively, when practiced together, are an opportunity to reinforce and build trust over time, and recognize and alleviate some of those inherent power imbalances that exist as a response to the way traditional philanthropy has perpetuated some of those imbalances. So I'm going to just pause right there and just remind us that there are a few things to note about trust-based philanthropy. The practices are not necessarily new. This work has existed in the practices of many organizations, including some of you all who are in attendance today. So we don't want to kind of claim that this work is new. It's also important to recognize that it looks different for different organizations. There is not a one-size-fits-all approach to trust-based philanthropy. So that's why with the work that we do at the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project and programs like this, we really strive to elevate different examples, different stories to show that there's a lot of ways to approach this. So multi-year unrestricted funding is one of the cornerstone practices of a trust-based approach. And as Phil mentioned, what that does is that it recognizes that the work of nonprofits is long-term and unpredictable. And so the multi-year and unrestricted funding gives grantees the flexibility to assess and determine where those dollars are most needed. And it allows for the innovation that we want to see. It allows for that kind of emergent action in times of crisis or unpredictable moments like we've seen in the last 18 months. It allows for building long-term sustainability for organizations. So it's, a lot of arguments have been made for this for many years, but this is why we often lead with this approach. And then remembering that we must apply an equity lens to this work. Looking at some of the data and recognizing which types of organizations are most likely to receive unrestricted funding and which organizations have a harder time receiving unrestricted funding, and looking at some of that data that exists out there, recognizing that there is a systemic inequity in which organizations have unrestricted assets and which ones don't. So this is just a data point that comes from our overview that Caitlin dropped into the chat. You can take a closer look at some of that stuff and some more specifics on this practice, but wanted to emphasize that. And then doing the homework has 2 features. One is doing the homework on the issue or the area that we are funding in, and the other part is doing the homework on prospective grantees to reduce the pre-proposal hoops that nonprofits have to jump through. So we're talking about flipping that script, like Phil said, really kind of taking on that onus to get to know prospective grantees and addressing and recognizing their time and honoring their time in those early vetting stages. And again, it's important to apply an equity lens to this work also. We need to check the internal kind of implicit biases that exist in this work, recognize how our systems and processes might favor more traditional legacy institutions, and they might leave out emerging organizations that are kind of in the earlier stages, and all the other kind of implicit biases that might come up in our practices. So we have to constantly also recognize when doing that work, we need to check for those biases. And then the paperwork. This is really about addressing the time, the time and honoring the time and looking at how extensive grant applications and reports just really distract nonprofits from focusing on their mission critical work. So the rationale behind being transparent and responsive is that open and honest communication can support relationships that can build trust and mutual accountability. And because funders are in the power seat, it's on us as funders to model transparency and responsiveness if we want to see that kind of transparency from our grantee partners. It also sets the stage for grantee partners to show up more fully. This is one of those kind of practices that really requires a self-awareness and a recognition of how, like Brenda said, who is at the power table and who is not, and how to really kind of be more intentional about how we show up and how we are, open and transparent in order to model and build trust-based relationships. Soliciting and acting on feedback. So you've already heard a bit about what it looks like to embody transparency. And I should mention, underscoring again with the transparency piece, for nonprofits, for grant seekers, when they're out there trying to build relationships with all different kinds of funders and foundations, it can feel very opaque. It can feel very, like there's these like big cement walls around these foundations and you don't even know how to get your foot in the door. So even recognizing that that has been the norm for a long time, beginning to open up open up those walls and, open up some lines of dialogue goes a long way, because otherwise you can't really build a productive relationship. And then this other practice of soliciting and acting on feedback is very much connected to that. Traditionally in philanthropy, we've kind of assumed, funders and foundations as the experts, setting the strategy, driving the work forward, putting out the project grants to get, to have grantees kind of deliver on the foundation strategy. And if we really want to be intentional about the power imbalance, I mean, that's kind of an obvious power imbalance if you've got one entity kind of setting the strategy and then nonprofits having to kind of fit their work into all these different boxes for multiple different foundations. So how do we begin to break down some of those walls? Through soliciting feedback. And this is a very practical expression of recognizing the wisdom and expertise of people who are closest to the issues that we're trying to address in philanthropy. So grantees and communities offer really valuable perspective that can inform our funding strategies, our approaches, can help us see how we're actually showing up, even if we think we're showing up in a certain way, and help us continue to learn and refine. Somebody in the chat posed some great values that align with these humility values that we're talking about. And this constant learning is a key part of that. The other thing that's really important to highlight here is to speak to what Brenda was sharing before about how these practices are so linked to advancing equity. Our sector is undeniably majority white, often putting resources into supporting issues that are experienced by a majority of people of color. So already right there, there's a power imbalance, a systemic imbalance. And so if our work is to support certain communities, shouldn't our work be informed by those who are experiencing those issues? And how can we be more intentional about getting feedback to have a more well-rounded view of what's going on? And how can we think about how this can influence our work and our cultural norms? Support beyond the check. This practice is one that acknowledges that as funders, we have so much more to bring to the table than dollars alone. We have access to networks. We've got websites that people are paying attention to. We've got platforms. We've got board members. There's so many different ways that we can offer additional support to grantee partners, community partners, cultural partners. I love hearing some of these other examples of how you all refer to the organizations that you support. And this is again, when we talk about this in light of racial equity, this is a particularly important aspect of the work, especially because we've got a lot of organizations in our sector that have historically gone without the same level of networks or support, haven't had access to the power seat, as Brenda mentioned. So really thinking about ways that we can offer, go beyond the check, to offer additional support, and again, see the organizations that we support as whole, living, breathing organizations with leaders that have whole lives and stresses and challenges that they're dealing with in order to lead these organizations.